In 1983, a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel wrote a report for the CIA. 28 pages, classified, eventually filed away and more or less forgotten. What the report concluded, and I want to be precise here because the language matters, is that human consciousness can exit the physical body, travel outside time, outside space, and that a specific audio technology, not developed by a government lab, not by DARPA, but by a radio broadcasting executive in rural Virginia, could make this happen reliably, repeatably. This document is real. You can download it right now from the CIA's own website, but there's one page they still won't release, and the reason why is more disturbing than anything the document actually contains. By the end of this, you'll know what the CIA actually concluded about human consciousness, not the Reddit summary, the document itself. You'll understand why a single missing page has generated more FOIA requests than almost anything else in the agency's declassified archive. And there's a third thing, something most coverage of this document skips entirely: why the program ended. Because the official explanation doesn't hold up, and what's underneath it is arguably the most interesting part of this whole story. Astral projection and psychic espionage are the surface. The real story is what happens when a government agency accidentally proves something it wasn't prepared to believe. To understand why the CIA funded research into consciousness and out-of-body experiences, you have to understand what was happening in the early 1970s. The Cold War wasn't only about nuclear warheads. It was about every conceivable edge: military, technological, psychological. In 1972, something specific landed on American intelligence desks that shifted the calculation. Soviet researchers were claiming, in official state publications and not in fringe journals, that psychic phenomena were real: telepathy, remote perception, mind-influencing physical systems, reproducible, documented. The CIA's response was closer to alarm than academic skepticism. Because if the Soviets had found a way to extract intelligence using only the human mind, the entire apparatus of physical surveillance, the satellites, the listening posts, the dead drops, was suddenly obsolete. So the CIA did what it always does with things it doesn't understand and can't afford to ignore. It started writing checks. Between 1972 and 1995, the U.S. government spent approximately $20 million on what became known as Project Stargate, a classified program to investigate whether trained individuals could perceive distant locations using only their minds. For a while, and this is the part that gets uncomfortable, it appeared to work. Remote viewers produced details about Soviet installations, specific details that were later checked against satellite imagery and held up. The results were inconsistent enough that you could dismiss them if you needed to, but specific enough that several people clearly didn't want to. But Project Stargate was still working within a familiar framework: trained operatives, controlled experiments, measurable outputs. The gateway process was something different. It wasn't about training operatives. It was about understanding what consciousness actually is. And nothing they had investigated before had prepared them for what Lieutenant Colonel Wayne McDonnell was about to put in writing. In 1983, the commander of the U.S. Army Operational Group gave McDonnell a specific assignment: figure out how the gateway experience works, evaluate it, determine whether it has intelligence applications. The gateway experience was a program developed by Robert Monroe, not a scientist, not a mystic, but a radio broadcasting executive who in the 1950s began accidentally having out-of-body experiences during relaxation. Instead of dismissing it, Monroe did something almost uniquely American. He turned it into a research institute. The technology Monroe developed was called hemi-sync, hemispheric synchronization. The mechanism is straightforward enough to explain. You play a tone of 400 hertz in one ear, a slightly different tone, 410 hertz, in the other. Your brain doesn't hear two separate tones. It produces a third one, the difference between them, 10 hertz, what's called a binaural beat. And then something interesting happens. Your brain tries to match it. Its electrical activity starts to synchronize to that frequency. Different frequencies correspond to different states. Beta for active thinking, theta for deep meditation, delta for dreamless sleep. Monroe's claim was that by precisely engineering these beats, you could guide consciousness into states ordinarily inaccessible through normal waking life, states where the normal boundary between self and the outside world begins to dissolve. MacDonald didn't dismiss this. He brought in biomedical engineer Itzhak Bentov to help construct a scientific framework, and what they produced together is where the document becomes remarkable. Here is what a classified CIA report written in 1983 actually says. This is a direct quote from CIA.gov. Fundamentally, the Gateway experience is a training system designed to bring enhanced strength, focus, and coherence to the amplitude and frequency of brainwave output between the left and right hemispheres so as to alter consciousness, moving it outside the physical sphere so as to ultimately escape even the restrictions of time and space. Escape even the restrictions of time and space. No forum post, no newsletter, a sentence written by a U.S. Army intelligence officer in a classified report filed with the CIA in 1983. MacDonald then draws on the work of physicist David Bohm, who proposed that reality is structured like a hologram with each part containing information about the whole, to argue that consciousness may not be a product of the brain at all. The brain as receiver, not generator, consciousness as a pattern of energy extending beyond the skull, potentially beyond the body itself. Near the end, MacDonald describes the stages of the Gateway experience in ascending order. Focus 10, mind awake, body asleep. Focus 12, expanded awareness. Focus 15, no sense of time. Focus 21, the edge of time-space itself. And then came the section about what happens beyond Focus 21. That section was on page 25. When the CIA declassified the Gateway Process Report in 2003, researchers noticed immediately. Page 25 was missing. No redaction, no blackout. The page simply wasn't there. Since then, hundreds of FOIA requests have been filed specifically demanding that page. Every single one has received the same response. The CIA says it has no record of page 25 ever existing. Think about that. They have 28 pages. They released 27. And the one they didn't release, they claim they never had. There are two ways to read this. The charitable one, it's a numbering error, a clerical gap in a document that was classified and largely ignored for 2 decades. Bureaucratic accident. It happens. The other reading, the one that has generated sustained investigative attention rather than forum speculation, is that page 25 was deliberately withheld, and the "we have no record" response is the cover for that. Based on the document's structure, page 25 would have covered the final, most advanced stages of the Gateway experience, the states beyond Focus 21, and the question becomes, what could possibly be more sensitive than what MacDonald already wrote? I want to ask you something genuinely. If page 25 exists and you believe it contains something the government didn't want public, what do you think it says? Leave it in the comments. Because the most compelling answer I've come across didn't come from a conspiracy theorist. It came from a Jungian analyst. Jung spent the last 30 years of his career on something that genuinely embarrassed his colleagues. Not quietly, openly. He studied alchemy, and not as a historian of chemistry. He was interested in what the alchemical tradition was actually encoding beneath the metallurgical language. The hermetic texts, running from the 2nd century through the Renaissance, turned out to contain, if you read them with a psychologist's eye, a surprisingly detailed map of the inner life, of what happens to consciousness when it moves beyond the boundaries of the individual ego. The alchemists described this movement as the dissolution of the barrier between the self and something larger. They gave it a Latin name, Mysterium Conjunctionis, the sacred union of opposites. But what they were mapping was a psychological territory, not a chemical one. The alchemists called it the Mysterium Conjunctionis, the dissolution of the boundary between the individual self and something larger. The Monroe Institute called it Focus 21 and Beyond. The CIA called it escaping the restrictions of time and space. The vocabulary is completely different. The territory being described is, as far as the primary sources can determine, identical. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, the idea that beneath personal memory there exists a layer of psychological structure shared by all human beings, mirrors directly what MacDonald describes as consciousness extending beyond the individual brain. Altered states as access points to a deeper structure underlying physical reality. The CIA's document, written in the language of physics and signal processing, is structurally making the same argument Jung made in the language of depth psychology. But here's the question nobody asks, the one that is, I'd argue, actually more unsettling than anything about page 25. If the CIA evaluated the gateway process, found it plausible in terms of physical science, confirmed potential intelligence applications, and produced a comprehensive scientific framework for understanding it, why did they stop? Project Stargate was defunded in 1995. Official reason, inconsistent results. But the gateway process wasn't evaluated for operational reliability. It was evaluated for what it revealed about the nature of consciousness itself. And MacDonald's conclusion was not that the phenomenon was impossible. His conclusion was that it was plausible, warranted further study, and pointed toward a model of reality more complex than the framework Western science normally operates within. That finding was filed, classified, and largely ignored for 20 years. The most unsettling possibility has nothing to do with psychic powers. It's simpler that the document's conclusion, whatever it was accurate, and that accuracy itself was the problem. Because if consciousness genuinely operates outside the constraints of time and space, a very large number of foundational assumptions, scientific, philosophical, political, start to become difficult to hold. There's no protocol for that kind of finding, no department. What you do, what any large institution does with information it can't process and can't safely ignore, is put it in a box, mark it classified, and wait, hoping the question eventually goes away on its own. Here's what we actually know. In 1983, a U.S. Army lieutenant colonel produced a classified document arguing that human consciousness can transcend time and space. That reality may be holographic in structure, and that a specific audio technology can reliably induce these states. The document was classified for 20 years, released with one page missing. The program subsequently defunded and buried. What nobody has answered officially and on the record is whether the program ended because it failed or because it didn't. That gap between we stopped because results were inconsistent and we stopped because we found something we couldn't use without consequences. That's not a minor distinction. It might be the whole story. The next video in this series asks a different version of the same question. The CIA's discovery about consciousness is one side of it. The other side is what happens when institutional and psychological structures are built to prevent that kind of question from ever being asked in the first place. 6 documented mechanisms independently identified by 3 researchers across 40 years of work. They explain something about the gateway process that the document itself never addresses. That's next week.